The wind on the Belarus front, viewed as one of the key points of the war between Ukraine and Russia, suddenly and completely reversed direction. The Minsk regime, which had stood out with its moves to pass Russia's nuclear-tipped missiles through Belarusian borders without hesitation, changed its stance. Alexander Lukashenko, Putin's most loyal ally, made a maneuver in mid-June that stunned the entire world. Lukashenko, who had used the harshest, most uncompromising rhetoric against the Kyiv administration since the first days of the war, publicly apologized to Volodymyr Zelensky. The Belarusian leader, while expressing regret for his past words, officially declared that they would absolutely not confront Ukraine as a military force. This historic declaration was a shocking acknowledgement of how militarily defenseless Belarus had become against Ukraine. So what exactly was the real military reality behind the mysterious backdrop of Lukashenko's preemptive acceptance of defeat and helplessness? The name at the helm of Minsk actually listed very striking reasons for this attitude change. Lukashenko confessed that the Kyiv administration knows Belarus like the back of its hand, and that his country has turned into an easy-to-read open book for the Ukrainian army. The most striking detail at this point was Lukashenko's open confirmation of the 500 strategic targets Ukraine has already identified on Belarusian territory.
Что наши основные объекты жизнеобеспечения, производственные и логистические, окажутся под ударом. Ну, как они заявили, у них уже 500 таких целей на территории Беларуси намечено.
You'll recall that toward the end of May 2026, Ukrainian Unmanned Systems Forces commander Robert Magyar Brovdy had delivered one of the harshest and clearest military ultimatums in history to the Belarusian administration. In those days, Belarus, thinking it had Russia's nuclear and conventional power behind it, hadn't paid much attention to this serious warning and had even given mocking responses. But with the changing dynamics at the front and Ukraine's deep strike capabilities reaching an incredible level, Lukashenko began to panic in the face of this target list's reality. Because if the Ukrainian army decides to push the button, all strategic infrastructure considered Belarus's main life support units would become non-functional within minutes. The backbone of these 500 targets is likely formed by military airbases and massive railway networks that Russia actively uses for logistics support. Because, as we've seen in the Ukraine war, such strategic points are consistently among the priority focus areas. Especially critical airfields like Machulishchy, Baranavichy, Lida, and Babruysk near Minsk are located in the very heart of Ukraine's priority strike range. Not just airbases, fuel and energy facilities that are the war's main bloodline, especially the strategically important Mazyr oil refinery, may also be at the very top of this list. Additionally, Belarus's military-industrial complexes, ammunition production facilities, repair workshops, radar stations, and underground command centers should not be forgotten. So how does the Ukrainian army know so precisely the exact coordinates of command echelons, underground shelters, and logistics routes beyond the border? It is made possible by the flawless intelligence network and intelligence architecture that Ukraine's main intelligence directorate and Ukraine's security service have established inside Belarus. According to media analyses and reports, Ukraine has been conducting uninterrupted surveillance operations over Belarusian territory for years, with high-resolution military satellites and real-time intelligence flows from its Western allies. Long-range reconnaissance drones capable of penetrating deep beyond the border are mapping the blind spots of air defense systems second by second by analyzing radar waves. Major media sources such as the Washington Post have been confirming these possibilities since the very beginning of the war. So can the Ukrainian army actually hit these 500 targets it has identified in Belarus? In fact, Kyiv has a tremendous military capacity and arsenal capable of precisely striking these strategic targets hundreds of kilometers beyond the border. Because the Ukrainian army's long-range strike architecture evolved into a completely hybrid and extremely difficult-to-stop phase, particularly in 2025 and 2026. Ukraine's unmanned systems forces have reached the capability of conducting operations with kamikaze drone swarms that can bypass electronic warfare systems, have low radar signatures, and possess ranges of hundreds of kilometers. Not just unmanned aerial vehicles, Ukraine's own domestically produced ballistic and cruise missiles are also positioned as the most dangerous players in this strategic equation. Especially the upgraded long Neptune missiles with ranges exceeding 1,000 kilometers and the Flamingo cruise missiles with a full 3,000-kilometer range capable of paralyzing enemy logistics comfortably cover all of Belarus. ATACMS and Storm Shadow missiles supplied by the West, whose usage restrictions have been largely lifted, are also flawless tools for military airfields and protected ammunition depots in Belarus. So Lukashenko is probably not wrong to be afraid of both the Ukrainian army's intelligence capabilities and its strike capacity when he apologized to Zelensky. On the other hand, the reasons for his fears are not limited to these alone. Another critical matter that is keeping Lukashenko awake at night and pushing him to apologize is directly related to the ruthless reality of geography and border lines. If Belarus launches an attack against Ukraine, the active battlefield would instantly expand, and a new 1,500-kilometer front line would emerge. Although the actual border length is approximately 1,085 kilometers, when operational depth and logistics corridors are factored in, this line means a massive 1,500-kilometer defense zone in military terms. Belarus has military-industrial complexes, ammunition production facilities, and underground complexes it can rely on. With this strength, it was able to threaten Ukraine or make harsh statements against the West. First of all, to see what Ukraine is prepared against, looking at the Belarus border is enough. Radio Svoboda's Belarus service and independent OSINT analysts identified at least 5 new Russian drone launch facilities near the Belarus border using satellite imagery. These facilities are in Russia's Bryansk, Oryol, and Smolensk regions, some just dozens of kilometers from Belarusian territory. The most notable is the Tsimbalova complex in the Oryol region. The facility spans an area exceeding 5 square kilometers and doubled in size in spring 2026. Russian state channel Zvezda describes it as the world's largest drone port, and this is not an exaggeration. According to OSINT data, the facility contains 93 garages and 15 large hangars. More than 500 drones can be stored simultaneously, and at least 175 drones are currently visible in shelters. 20 maintenance garages operate alongside 8 fixed launch ramps. There is a 2.5-kilometer launch road designed for mass takeoffs. Simultaneous salvo launches from mobile platforms are possible. In May 2026, new 85-meter rail launch systems were detected. These are designed for the new generation jet-powered drones known as Garan 5. Garan 5 is faster than the classic Shahed and much harder to intercept. 10 new Garan 5 ramps were added within a month, and construction continues without slowing down. Currently, these jet-powered drones can only be launched from 2 points: Tsimbalova and occupied Donetsk. The Shabolovo military airfield in the Smolensk region is the second critical facility, only 46 kilometers from the Belarus border. Construction began in January 2026, and satellite imagery shows 4 fixed launch ramps and 4 specialized launch vehicles. This configuration enables launching 22 Shaheds simultaneously, hundreds in a single night. Russia deployed an air defense battery to protect the facility. They know Ukraine can strike it. The Sescha airfield in the Bryansk region is also 45 kilometers from the Belarus border and has been one of the main bases for Shahed operations since 2022. British military intelligence confirms this. The reason these facilities are positioned so close to the Belarus border is operational. Drones reach Ukraine's northern and central regions, especially the Kyiv, Chernihiv, and Sumy directions, by passing through Belarusian airspace. Flying over Belarusian airspace shortens Ukraine's detection and destruction time because Belarus doesn't intervene. No radar warning, no interception, no shootdown. This silence is not staying out of the war, it's de facto partnership. The most striking event showing the scale of this partnership occurred in 2025. 19 Russian drones passing over Belarus entered Polish airspace, and Warsaw invoked NATO's Article 4 for the first time in history. Being a drone launch pad threatens not just Ukraine, but NATO's entire eastern flank. Belarus's role in the war is not limited to the sky. It's also performing a critical function on the ground: Russia's gas station. Since the start of the war, Ukraine has been conducting systematic attacks on Russian oil refineries. 24 of the 33 largest Russian refineries were struck. Some were forced to completely suspend operations, and Russia's oil processing capacity dropped to its lowest level since 2009. This strategy is working, but it has an unexpected side effect. Belarus began filling Russia's fuel gap. According to Moscow Times data, in the first 5 months of 2026, gasoline exports from Belarus to Russia increased 13-fold compared to the previous year. Diesel exports tripled. The Novopolotsk and Mazyr refineries, two large facilities with a combined annual capacity of 24 million tons, process crude oil imported from Russia and send the resulting fuel directly to the Russian domestic market and to world markets via Russian ports. Belarus has effectively turned into the fuel supplier of Russia's war machine. And there is a paradox to this transformation. The more successfully Ukraine strikes Russia's energy infrastructure, the more critical Belarus's role becomes, and the more dependent Lukashenko becomes on Moscow. But the other side of the coin is more dangerous. The two Belarusian refineries feeding Russia's war machine are now Ukraine's legitimate targets. Lukashenko may think he's outside the war, but his refineries produce the fuel for the tanks Russia sends to the front. Drone launchpad and fuel supplier are Belarus's indirect contributions, but the Kremlin's plans point to a much more direct intervention. On June 5th, a secret meeting was held in Brest, western Belarus. Senior officials from Minsk conveyed provocative action plans against Ukraine by Kremlin instruction to regional administrators and demanded full loyalty. Ukrainian intelligence is aware of the meeting, and this development is not an isolated event. President Zelensky announced, based on intelligence data, that Russia is preparing attack plans toward the Chernihiv-Kyiv direction from Belarusian territory or the Bryansk region. Commander-in-Chief Sescha also confirmed that the Russian General Staff is actively working on northern offensive calculations. According to RBC Ukraine sources, the Kremlin is evaluating 5 different scenarios. The most realistic is an attempt to create a buffer zone 10 to 20 kilometers deep in the Chernihiv region. The least realistic is a direct assault on Kyiv, a plan tried and failed in 2022. The scenarios in between are designed to tie down Ukrainian forces in the north, force unit withdrawals from the Donetsk front, and apply psychological pressure. Zelensky also reported that the Kremlin is preparing a new mobilization wave of 100,000 personnel. This force is planned to be allocated to northern operations. Ukraine is preparing for this threat. Volyn Oblast, in Ukraine's northwest, bordering both Belarus and Poland, sits on the NATO resupply corridor through which Western military and humanitarian aid passes. The region's military administration deputy head Romaniuk announced that anti-drone nets will be installed on road sections near the Belarus border. Engineering barriers are being built along the border, defensive positions are being strengthened, and surveillance systems are being upgraded. The current threat level is low. Only 1,900 soldiers are deployed on the Belarusian side, and Russia doesn't have sufficient forces at the border for a major operation. Transporting tens of thousands of soldiers to Belarus cannot be done secretly, and war technology has changed radically since 2022. The border has been fortified, mined, and Ukrainian drones would reduce such an attack's speed to an agonizing tempo. Sending infantry and tanks to Kyiv didn't work in 2022. There's no reason it would work a second time. But Putin's actual calculation may be different. The threat itself forces Ukraine to keep forces in the north, and every brigade tied to the north is a brigade missing from the south. Putin is creating a threat, but the leverage in Ukraine's hands is incomparably stronger than 2022. In the military dimension, the balance has completely changed. Ukrainian Drone Forces commander Magyar announced that the first 500 high-value military targets in Belarus have been pre-programmed: bases, command centers, logistics nodes. This is not just rhetoric. Ukraine's FP-5 Flamingo cruise missile has a 3,000-kilometer range, and all of Belarus is within this range. The Novopolotsk and Mazyr refineries, playing a critical role in Russia's fuel crisis, are now Ukraine's legitimate targets. And the Belarusian army's capacity to counter this is limited: a small army, old equipment, and units with no combat experience. According to Carnegie's analysis, Ukraine has become incomparably stronger. Lukashenko cannot pose a counter threat without outside help. Military superiority has also transformed the diplomatic arena. Zelensky has significantly hardened his policy toward Belarus in the last 6 months. He implemented 2 new sanctions packages against Lukashenko and his circle. He met with Belarus opposition leader Svetlana Tsikhanouskaya in Vilnius for the first time, and then received her in Kyiv. These steps send a clear message to Minsk. Ukraine no longer recognizes Lukashenko's legitimacy and is treating the opposition as its counterpart. Zelensky also openly said that Ukraine is prepared to take preventive measures against Belarus, directly messaging Minsk by saying, "We have the capability to strengthen our defense and conduct preventive work." French President Macron, at Zelensky's request, called Lukashenko for the first time in more than 4 years to explain the consequences of further involvement. This call is a signal that Europe's view of Belarus has changed. Before 2022, Belarus was seen as a neutral buffer. Now everyone sees it as Russia's military extension. Carnegie's assessment summarizes the situation. Keeping Minsk on edge no longer carries real risk for Kyiv. There is no incentive for it to restrain its rhetoric. 3 years ago, Lukashenko stood up to Zelensky. Today, he's trying to reduce tensions and offering talks. This transformation is the clearest proof that Ukraine's deterrence is working. Deterrence is working, but to understand Lukashenko's situation, you also need to look at the other side of the coin. Even as Ukraine grows stronger, Lukashenko cannot say no to Putin, and this paradox traps him between 2 forces. His dependency on Putin is not abstract but concrete. When hundreds of thousands of Belarusians poured into the streets during the 2020 election crisis, what saved Lukashenko was Putin's support. Security guarantees, intelligence support, diplomatic shield. Since that day, opposition leaders have been imprisoned or sent into exile, independent media has been shut down, and Lukashenko's power has become entirely dependent on Moscow's guarantee. Economic dependency is no less than political dependency. EU and US sanctions hit Belarus's export revenues. Potash was cut from the European market, airspace was restricted, and financial channels were narrowed. Minsk leaned increasingly on Moscow, and Putin knows and uses this dependency. But he also cannot enter the war, because the entry cost is too heavy for the regime to bear. The most critical loss would be the Washington table, the dialogue with the US that began in recent months, sanctions relief in exchange for political prisoner swaps, the US envoy mentioning the possibility of Lukashenko's America visit, Washington pressuring Poland and Lithuania on potash transit. Is Lukashenko's only alternative lifeline to Moscow? Entering the war would instantly cut this line. EU sanctions would harden, and the economy would become 100% dependent on Russia. With Russia already struggling with its war economy, its capacity to subsidize Belarus is limited. The Ukrainian leverage we saw in the previous section would come into play. Refineries, bases, and infrastructure become targets. And perhaps the most critical risk is on the home front. Soldier casualties, economic collapse, and a new wave of anger. Lukashenko knows better than anyone how fragile a foundation 2020 created. The contradictory messages at Grodno are a direct reflection of this entrapment. In the same speech, Lukashenko said, "We don't want to fight in Ukraine," and a few minutes later added, "We are ready to defend Russia." He offered talks to Zelensky, but the same week held joint nuclear exercises with Russia and continues to host the Oreshnik missile system on his territory. This inconsistency is not random. It's the language of trying to message both sides simultaneously. Carnegie's analysis shows where this balance is heading. Fear and confusion about where this is going are clearly visible on Lukashenko's face. We will continue to follow these developments. Subscribe to the Geo Network. Thank you for watching. One final reminder, if you're thinking, I want the analyses to continue even when I step away from the screen, we also await you on Spotify to shorten your long drives and turn traffic into an enjoyable listening experience.